Okay, so we're going to be picking up where we just left off was talking about organizational theories and the general idea that there's three broad theories that we can use at to basically examine an organization. That we can look from kind of classical organizational theory, focusing on the hierarchical structure, how management is laid out. We can look at it from a humanistic theory of how do we establish a better culture, a better environment, a better organization, as the way it actually interacts with its employees. And finally, the open systems model, kind of a more cause and effect model that examines the inputs, the throughputs, and the outputs, and how the organization exists within that environment. We're now going to talk about specifically developing organizations, and we're going to talk briefly about the field of industrial organizational psychology that is organizational development. So organizational development is a planned, organization-wide effort to increase organizational effectiveness through behavioral science knowledge and technology. So, again, one of those definitions that's very highly packed. So one of the key things is this is an organizational-wide effort. In other words, it's not about individual interventions. It's about redesigning entire organizations. It's about changing the way the organization functions from any of those theories. So from a classical organizational theory, it may be about redesigning how levels of management and span of control works in an organization. From a humanistic theory, it may be focused on changing the attitudes, the behavioral systems, the reward systems, how people are motivated in the organization, again at an organizational-wide level. And from an open systems model, it may be looking at all of the elements. How do we change our inputs, our throughputs, and our outputs? How do we increase getting usable feedback? And how do we make sure this organization can continue to develop in the environment it is? Again, all of this is going to be based, though, from a behavioral science knowledge. So we're going to be using both previous research and science on how to maximize organizational development, in other words, helping an organization get to its goals. But we're also going to be testing ourselves through the process. So we're going to look at an organization and go, where is it today, and how can we measure where it is today? So what is the level of how close are we to getting to the goals of the organization, how much productivity, what's the profit margin of this organization? And if we implement changes, we're going to want to actually monitor that performance, those attaining of goals, to make sure that the changes result in an increase, a level of productivity, more actual success at attaining the goals. So it is as much about helping people within the organization as it is about making the organization more productive. And a lot of times, a way to think of organizational development is more of a top-down but organizational-wide application of all of the individual elements that we've been talking about in this class and will talk about in this class. So it's not a short-term patch to hide a problem. It's really the idea of creating a structure within the organization that allows it to adapt more quickly to changes in the environment, to allow it to become more productive, and to constantly be checking its progress and changing if necessary to keep that organization productive. So some important characteristics of organizational development programs. Typically, solid and successful organizational development is going to involve the total organization. So it's both top-down as far as it's usually being initiated from the very top levels. However, it goes throughout the entire organization. So if you're doing anything in an organization that affects only portions of the organizations or one element of the throughputs of the organization, or just focuses on the inputs, you're probably not doing organizational development. Organizational development is taking a very big picture approach to increasing the productivity of an organization. It's usually supported or initiated by top management, and in fact, if it isn't supported by top management, organizational development often will find failure right there. It needs to be supported by both top management and endorsed by that process, and it's often initiated by that top management. The entire purpose of organizational development is to diagnose and implement plans. It is to diagnose problems, but those problems may be at any level of the organization at any point, and to implement a series of plans to basically fix any problems. It is a long-term process, and in reality, it often is a permanent, continuing process. That it's not only about long-term change of the organization, it's about recognizing that whatever change is necessary for the organization this year may be different than what is needed in the next year or the year after. It does focus on changing attitudes, behaviors, and performance of the groups and teams in the organization. And it's not just about changing procedures, it's also about focusing on the human element. Organizational development often draws from all three theories of organizational design. It draws from scientific management and classic organizational theory, thinking about how management actually interacts with employees, the structure of the organization. It looks at the humanistic approach on how do we actually increase the attitudes, the job satisfaction, reduce the stress of working in this environment. And finally, from an open systems model, what are we actually bringing in, how are we processing it, and how are we actually putting it back out to get to the organization's goals. And again, all solid organizational development programs are going to be very focused on the goals and objectives of the organization and how to increase the success of getting to those goals. So, why do organizations need organizational development? Again, I think probably the argument is kind of self-evident, but it mainly occurs because of changes in organizational operating environment. So what often will make an organization aware that it needs to bring in a top-down complete organizational redevelopment is usually a shock to the system. So these changes can be social, they can be technical, they can be economic, they can be political, but usually an organization that suddenly decides, wow, we need to start thinking in terms of organizational development, it usually occurs because the things that were working are no longer working. In other words, the organization recognizes the way we've done business in the past has worked, but now it suddenly isn't because of a change. We need to change with it. Now, organizational development can also be incorporated by an organization that wants to head off that happening in the first place. And there are definitely organizations that are forward-thinking that basically build organizational development into their structures to begin with. But a lot of times when we find IO psychologists, external consultants being brought in, it's because there's been this kind of shock to the system. Hitt in 2000 argues that the competitive landscape of the future will be characterized by two major changes. In other words, basically, the researchers and the people that are looking at what the future of the workplace is going to look like are expecting that there's going to be two major changes that are going to affect almost all organizations. In other words, almost all organizations are going to need to change in the future to adapt to the technological revolution, the knowledge explosion, and this is still ongoing. A lot of people tend to think of, well, we've seen it. The internet exists, smartphones exist, this technological knowledge explosion has happened. But it is still ongoing, and organizations are still adapting. Current news reports of hackers, both private hackers, other company hackers, and even other governments hacking into organization systems and stealing or hurting that organization through the exposure of their knowledge. That is still a revolutionary change that's occurring, and organizations are having to adapt to that reality. Also, globalization. So the globalization has been a major factor in large multinational companies, obviously, but even smaller companies are starting to have to recognize that their target markets need to be larger and larger and more global. This is, again, causing organizations, even smaller ones, to have to change the way they're doing business. A good example of this is there's actually a local barrel maker in Missouri. It's one of the few actual people that are still creating barrels, and it's one of the major sources. And for years, they primarily shipped their products down to the bourbon industry in Kentucky. I was recently actually on a tour of their facility, and they were talking about how every single year more and more of their business is being shipped overseas. They're a small family-owned business in rural Missouri with about 25 employees that over the last 5 years has been adapting their business to the fact that the vast majority of what they're now selling is actually going to international markets. Also, this includes the increasing diversity of workforce. So as organizations globalize, they're also going to see more diversity in their workforce, and that can also cause changes and issues within an organization that may require that organization to develop. And really, when we're talking about organizational development, what development means is growth. That an organization is needing to grow and to change. So the models of organizational change. There's basically three elements. So what we're now talking about is the tools or the methods and theories that an industrial organizational psychologist would use if they're being asked to do organizational development in a company. So the first thing to recognize is there's three basic elements of any process of organizational change or organizational development. There's the change agent, there's the recipient of the change, and there's the intervention itself. So the first is just simply the individual who's initiating the change process. This often is going to be external to the organization and significantly involved in diagnosing and classifying the organization's problems. So the change agent is going to be the person that's actually measuring and examining the organization to find areas that can be changed. It's the person that is actually initiating the need for that organization to change. The recipient of the change, the client, needs to be kept abreast of the ideas and considered by the change agent. So basically, the change agent, the person suggesting organizational change and development, needs to recognize that what they're looking at is they're also needing to account for the people that are going to be changing the way they do business, changing the way the organization is structured, and those are the clients. And finally, there's the intervention itself, the programs or initiatives suggested and implemented by the change agent, and it intentionally disrupts the status quo. And that's something to really recognize, is that in order to change an organization, you are having to change the status quo. And people are naturally, the clients, the recipients of this effort, are going to tend to be resistant to that kind of change. Anyone who's used to doing something a certain way is going to be resistant to someone coming in and saying, you need to change the way you do things. And we need to recognize that when we're actually creating organizational development. So there's two broad models of organizational change. The first one we're going to talk about is Levin's change model. So change as a matter of modifying those forces acting to keep things stable. So Levin, I know there's a W there, but it's actually pronounced Levin, he was German, is one of the people that is credited with being kind of the founders of industrial organizational and specifically organizational psychology. Did an enormous amount of applied research in the 40s and 50s. And his suggestion is to accept that an organization has a tendency to want to be stable. It tries to stabilize. It wants to keep things the same. And therefore, any effort to change an organization needs to go through three processes: unfreezing, moving, and refreezing. So the first part of any organizational development is the recognition that force is going to be required to make sure that you break down the status quo. You have to unfreeze the way organizations do things. You have to go in and make an active effort to suggest we're going to change things. We're not doing them the same way anymore. That's the unfreezing process. The next part is the moving process. This is where the real organizational change actually happens. It is the interventions. Okay, now that we've got you all ready to try new things, here's how we're now going to do the throughputs of this organization. Here's how we're going to change how we bring the inputs into this organization. Here's how we're going to change what we're actually producing. Once all those interventions are in place, you then want to refreeze. The changes are stabilized. A new level of equilibrium is reached. So you now want to basically get them back to where the new method is now the new status quo. And that's when you actually want to make the comparison to find out if the change helped or worked. So during the unfreezing process, the very start of unfreezing is going to be to actually measure what level of performance the company is at. You then begin the unfreezing process, you begin the moving process, you make all the implemented changes, and then you wait for it to refreeze. You wait for it to become the new status quo. And that's when you measure to find out, has it worked? If it's worked, you're probably done for a little while. If it hasn't worked, you restart the process. You need to unfreeze it again, move it again, and then again refreeze and see if this has actually taken effect. So the refreezing process, by the way, is probably the easiest of these because, again, Levin's model of change, the change model, assumes that status quo is where we want to be, that organizations naturally tend to defend the way they're doing things. The other model of organizational change is also developed by Levin, and it was basically a counter to the initial concept. So his initial model is focused on the idea of we unfreeze, we move, we refreeze. So it's a very much start, middle, and end model. The problem with this is that most organizational change is a continuous ongoing process. So the action research model suggested by Levin takes this into account. So you would be using his initial model, the unfreezing, movement, and refreezing model, if you're going into an organization to do some specific changes, and once you're done, that organization is going to be stable again. Action research model better predicts what happens when you have ongoing organizational development. So its major characteristic is it has a very cyclic nature. There's a constant cycle going on. Initial research about organization is the foundation. So you start by really doing a study of what does the organization look like. Again, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? What's the throughputs? What's the environment? And then this, in turn, provides information that can be used to guide further action. In other words, once we evaluate where an organization is, what can be changed to make the organization better? And then the idea here, again, is that research is informing this entire practice. And all organizational development is very much focused on data collection and research, informing the interventions and the practice. So comparing these two models, the change model is a start, middle, and end model. We come into an organization, we measure what's going on. Once we determine how the organization is functioning, we unfreeze it, we mix things up, we break up what's going on, and we get people open to the idea of changing how they do things. We implement that change, and then we let that change become the new status quo, and we look to see if the organization is better. The action research model is below. Problem perception and identification. So again, it's specifically, instead of, this is all normally happening in the change model, this would occur in the unfreezing. We identify a problem, and we identify it. We then have consultations with our organizational development expert and senior management about what is the problem. We gather data and make a diagnosis. So that data is then going to be given as feedback to the organizational client. Here's the data that suggests what needs to be changed. The joint diagnosis of the problem, so the organizational consultant and the senior management decide what needs to be done. An action plan is created of how to address it. The action is taken, and then data is gathered again. Once again, this cycle now continues to repeat. So once we start, those first two purple boxes outside of the circle is when an organizational consultant first comes in. But the idea is once you actually start organizational development, that cycle will continue from then on, continuously gathering data to provide feedback, to allow for the joint diagnosis of problems, to implement new plans and new changes. Those changes are then acted on, action, which then you gather more data. So organizational development interventions. So effective interventions fit the needs of the organization. Not all interventions are right for all organizations. And this is really, again, a strong indicator of that idea that in IO psychology, one of the guiding goals, if you will, is the phrase, it depends. No one intervention is going to work for all organizations. Some organizations function very well with bureaucracies. Some function very poorly with bureaucracies. It's about actually finding out, what is this organization like? What is the structure? Is it theory Y? Is it theory X? Is that working? What's the inputs? What's the throughputs? What's the outputs? What will work for this organization? It's based on causal knowledge of intended outcomes. So again, organizational development needs to know what are the goals of the organization. And we should believe that interventions are proper means to those desired ends. So a part of organizational development is also selling it to the employees and the management and the upper management of, this is how this intervention is going to make everyone more productive, make this organization better. Transfer change management competence to organizational members. So members should be better able to carry out planned changes after the intervention. Need for organizational development consultants tend to lessen. So what that means is that a good, effective organizational development intervention at some point gets a critical mass to where the organization now just functions in this mode automatically. Now, there may still be occasional times when an organizational consultant will be needed to be involved, and sometimes organizations will still have a department that's their focus is organizational development. But the idea is, once you get the ball rolling, people get used to the idea of, how are we doing it? Let's measure it. Are we doing it well? If not, how do we change? Let's change. Let's see if the change is working. So there's just some types of organizational development interventions. These are just somewhat methods that are sometimes used. I'm going to talk about techno-structural interventions in a little bit more detail. But survey feedback, so basically one of the tools organizational development experts, IO psychologists, will use is just creating a culture of data collection. So collecting survey feedback. The implementation of a 360-degree performance appraisal system would often be involved in this kind of organizational development. Team building, so changing an organization from individuals working individually to working in teams and creating those teams, building those teams, and getting those teams to become a part of the culture is another tool that will often be used in organizational development. Total quality management, TQM. We're not going to. This would be an entire lecture unto itself. If you have more questions about this, I strongly encourage you to look up and find some resources about total quality management. But again, it's basically a catchphrase used to capture the idea of incorporating that action research model into how you manage. Gain sharing is the idea of actually restructuring an organization to where the employees actually see portions of the profit. Positive organizational development is again about trying to actually create a system where the organizational development is creating positive change in the organization as seen by the attainment of goals. And organizational transformation is again the idea of taking an entire organization and transforming every level of its production, every level of its inputs, throughputs, and outputs. So let's talk a little bit more about the idea of technostructural interventions, because these are a little bit easier to kind of conceptualize in what they look like within an organization. So technostructural interventions focus on the technology and structure of the organization. So in a way, these are providing information about different ways to structure an organization other than a bureaucracy. So remember, a bureaucracy is that classic organizational theory. Very centralized leadership and multiple levels of management, with each level being more and more individuals, and each individual having a span of control of multiple employees at a lower level that report to them. So with technology, we've also been allowed to start to look at different ways to structure organization. So functional organizational design is structured according to the employee's function. So basically, a structured organizational design structures an organization based on grouping employees by similar function. So middle management would be a functional level. Line workers would be a functional level. Secretarial staff would be a functional level. Product-based organizational design allows managers of a particular division to focus on their division. So in this case, every individual project or product or project would have its own staff at all levels. So for example, if you're looking at a functional organizational design, everyone that creates the actual physical products on the construction floor would be considered at the same level. And a product-based design, if you're on a team that makes pretzels, then you're reporting to the pretzel management and the pretzel secretarial staff and the pretzel product development team. You wouldn't be involved with any of the other products that are being produced by the organization. So again, think of a larger company that might have multiple products. It may move away from a functional organizational design to a product-based organizational design. Matrix design combines function and product-based structures. So functional organizational design usually is more successful in a company that is producing one major product or one closely clustered group of products. Product-based organizational design is usually more effective for very large companies that have many different products. Matrix structure is an attempt to kind of combine function and product-based structures, and you often find it usable and most useful in mid-sized companies that are slowly moving from a single product but haven't quite become a giant company with multiple projects. So re-engineering includes 4 elements: fundamental, radical, dramatical, and organizational projects, and again it revolves around informational technology. So the idea of re-engineering an organization, so the first 3 bullet points here: functional organizational design, product-based organizational design, and matrix structure, are 3 broad different ways to look at how to set up the actual structure of an organization. Re-engineering is a term we often use when we talk about how we're actually going to change an organization based on how informational technology is changing. Is it going to be a dramatic change, radical? Is it affecting the organizational processes? And is it fundamental? So these are, again, just kind of a different way to look at how we might be changing an organization, not based on their structure of where people are assigned, but how that organization actually communicates to itself. So the influences on organizational design when deciding what kind of design an organization would be best served by, the first question often is what is the environment the organization is existing in? So again, what is the economic climate? What is the perceptions of that organization? The next one is how big is the organization? So again, a functional design usually works better with somewhat smaller organizations with single products. A product-based design is definitely a better organizational structure for very large organizations. What kind of technology is involved within the organization? And technology here includes also the need for communication. So can communication function slowly? Does it need to function very quickly? And that's, again, the idea of re-engineering. Re-engineering is about determining how quick and how fast do decisions need to be made and how much information is available at every level. So if the only person in an organization that has all the information necessary to make big decisions is at the very top, then a bureaucracy is going to work very well. It's going to work well. So that central decision maker makes decisions, and then that information is slowly funneled down through the bureaucratic organization. The problem with that is if that organization needs quick decision making, if people on the actual line or individual locations need to be able to make quick decisions based on the size of the organization, that's not going to be a good structure. In other words, technology is about how quickly communication needs to be used and utilized in an organization. The global impact, so again, how much impact does the organization have and how much does it want to have? And finally, the goals of the organization. All of these need to be taken into account when determining how to design a better organization. So for the remainder of this lecture, I'm just going to give you some examples of specific organizational designs. So this is a functional organizational design, and this is also a very good example of kind of classical bureaucracy. We have a president and a CEO. Then under that president, we have various VPs, but each in charge of an entire part of the organization. So the VP of manufacturing, for instance, would be in charge of all manufacturing in the organization, no matter what they're making. The VP of marketing would be in charge of marketing all of the products, no matter what they are. The VP of research and development would be in charge of all of the research and development of products across, again, everything the company does. And finance and human resources would all be, again, handled within the entire organization. Under each one of these VPs would be additional levels of management, and finally the actual people that are actually doing it. Now this is just the very top of organization of a fairly large one. We would continue to see this process of more and more people at each level going down. In contrast, here's a product-based organizational design. So again, at the very top, we have upper-level decision-making happening in the president and the chief executive officer. But now we have VPs that are in charge of an entire product line. So in this case, product A, product B, product C. And under each VP would be the directors of that product. So the director of manufacturing that product, the director of research and development, the director of marketing, and the director of finance. So let's say our products are, this company makes automobiles, it makes heavy transport boats, and it also makes helicopters. So that's our products A, B, and C. So vehicles, cars, transport boats, and helicopters. So with the product C, helicopters, that vice president, the director of manufacturing there, only works with manufacturing helicopters. The research and development branch only works on researching and developing helicopters. The director of marketing is only marketing those helicopters. And the director of finance is only keeping track of the financial health of that particular division. This is a product-based organizational design. Now, the combining of those two is what's often referred to as a matrix organizational design. We'll usually see this in a mid-sized company that is in the process of adapting from being a single product company to a multinational multi-product company. In this case, we have two levels of management. We have the traditional level of management, a VP in charge of all manufacturing, a VP in charge of all marketing, a VP in charge of all research and development, and a VP in charge of all finance. But additionally, we have a coordinator for our first product, a coordinator for our second product, and our coordinator for Project C. So this allows one VP to be keeping track of all the management that's going on in the organization. But there's also individual coordinators that are just worried about the production and manufacturing in their particular product. The plus side of this allows a lot of kind of optimization of management in a mid-sized organization. The downside is, think if you're actually in that first box, product A, manufacturing staff. So first, it basically means you have two bosses. You're reporting to both the overall VP of manufacturing, but you're also reporting to the coordinator of your particular product. And you may get basically interacting or contradictory information. So the VP of manufacturing is looking at manufacturing across all divisions. And they may be basically starting implementations or interventions that are meant to affect all manufacturing. But at the same time, you've got a coordinator of the specific products that your team is working on. So again, you may be basically information that isn't necessarily, you're basically can be in conflict between the different expectations of your different bosses.